All right, before we exhale, we're going to talk in the next 8 to 10 minutes. We're going to give you a primer, a little mini seminar on the air, what the Electoral College is. We call this everything almost. We're not going to be that immodest. Almost everything, Oliver, you need to know about what this animal is called the Electoral College that will decide the White House. All right, beginning now. First of all, the Electoral College is not a college in the classic sense of the term. It's not a college where you go take classes. It is a concoction, for lack of a better word, going all the way back to a series of convening meetings with the founding fathers, while Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and especially Madison and John Hay and John Jay, at the series of conventions that they had in Philadelphia, actually in Washington and in Philadelphia, in 1787, hammering out the republic that we call the United States of America. Now, when the founding fathers at those meetings, one of the issues that they grappled with is how do we determine who will be the president and the vice president of the United States? The conventional thinking was simply a popular vote. Leroy Jackson, you vote for president or candidate A or candidate B, and if you get enough of those votes, candidate A or candidate B, let's say candidate A gets, for sake of conversation, 101 votes, candidate B gets 100 votes, simple majority. Candidate A is elected the president of the United States, the popular vote. The founding fathers they weren't comfortable with that, Leroy. They were not comfortable, Oliver, with leaving it to you to decide. And we'll check off the reasons why. Number one, they didn't like the idea of what they call the tyranny of the majority. You hear that term a lot, and that's written and referenced a lot in the convention minutes. Madison talked about that, John Jay talked about that, Washington talked about that, and Jefferson talked about, and all of the other 125 or so members that were there at those meetings. They weren't all there at the same time. They came in and out. You know, some of them had businesses they had to run. Some of them had plantations. They had to run. You know where I'm going with that one. So anyway, they weren't comfortable with the popular vote. One person, one vote. Back then it was one man, one vote. Now, what they decided was a compromise. We will allow, not the popular vote, but we will allow what we call electors to determine who the president and or vice president will be. What are these electors? Before we get to who they are and why, let me tell you the rationale for that. One, they were deeply suspicious, the founding fathers. Many of them were planters. They were Southerners. They were aristocrats. They were plantation owners, i.e. slave owners. They weren't comfortable with that because they felt that the small states in the South were rural, agrarian, with little population. Now, follow me on this. Little population meaning they're going to be shortchanged on the popular vote. Not enough people. They're looking at Massachusetts, New York, the big northeast states, and Pennsylvania, the industrial states. They had the population. They had the industrial might. They knew over time these were going to be the big states of the North and eventually the Midwest and the West. And the southern states, the small states, they'd be shortchanged. So what do we do? What do we do to balance this out? Now we come back to the Electoral College. Well, before we even get to that, if, in fact, the presidency was decided on the popular vote, that means, Oliver, that, say, Massachusetts, say, New York, say, Pennsylvania, that had the population numbers, they would determine the presidency every time, just simply because of numbers. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, sparse population, they'd be shortchanged. In other words, their political power and economic power would not, in fact, be the dominant force. It would not come to play. They would always be politically outgunned by the big states, the northern states, the industrial states, the populated states. Now we come back to the Electoral College. What they decided to do was with the Electoral College is this. Each state, based on not population, but electors, would have a certain number of electors. So, for example, Wisconsin has 12 electors. Alabama has 11 electors. California, which has population, not then, but now, has 55 electors based on population. But there's an imbalance there. Why does Wisconsin or even Wyoming has 3 electors? Why do they even have any electors at all? Take Wyoming, for example. The population of the state couldn't even fit in one block in L.A. You see the problem with that. All right, so we come back to the electors to balance everything out. To win the presidency, it takes 270 electoral votes. Now, let's do the math for a minute. 270 electoral votes. The presidency, 271. You're president of the United States and presumably vice president, too. So the small states now have a preponderance of influence because they have a number of electoral votes. If it was just popular votes, Wisconsin would be out in the cold versus California or New York. No way. Can you imagine Wyoming versus California? Out in the cold based on simply numbers of voters, i.e. the popular vote. The Electoral College was there as a firewall, as a balancing act. Now, what many people say is, and Europeans that come over here from other countries, they don't understand the Electoral College. Theirs is simply one person, one vote. And they don't understand why this Electoral College, why you need a third party to do this. Why can't we just have the popular vote? Here are the arguments for. Now, before we even actually get to that, the arguments for and against. There are currently 538, Oliver, electors total. So now, remember, let's do the math now. Get your little computer out. Back in the old days, Leroy, we actually had to do it, Oliver. You're too young to remember. We had to actually get a pencil and paper, and do things back then. All right, Ricky, you don't even know about that. But I do. Pencil, paper, 1 + 1 = 2 on paper, not your little computer. All right, 538 electors total, 270 electorals to win, to put you over the top. Remember, that splits the difference. Now, with every 10 years, we know we have to do a different count based on the census, based on numbers, and a reapportionment of districts and also electors. But what happens is the small states, we're talking about the southern states and, of course, the Midwest, their electoral votes, they still go up no matter what. Now, let's get to the mechanics of this, Oliver. Who is an elector? Ricky, you just can't walk in and be an elector. The parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, they get together, and what they do, they can choose their electors based on, 1, loyalty. Leroy, you are a big donor, Republican or Democrat. We're going to have Leroy as one of our electors. Oliver, you're a good party guy. You get out there and, you beat the pavement every year for your candidate. We're going to bring Oliver in. You're going to be an elector. Ricky, we had a convention. Some states actually have conventions to determine electors. The Republican and the Democratic Party have their conventions, and they pick electors. Remember, the operative term is the number of electors in the state that you have or can have. So in Wisconsin, you'll have 12 electors, and that means that the Republican Party split down the middle based on the percentage of their vote. The Republican Party might have 7 electors, or it could be the Democrats, which means you have a balance of 5 electors. It's not even 6-6. It's not split that way. What happens is on the second Wednesday after the election, the electors get to all the electors. They convene, and then they tally up the electoral votes, and they make it official at that point. It's not decided and not confirmed the presidency, not on the night of the election or a couple of days after. It's that second Wednesday of the second week in December when, in fact, the electorals, all of them are put together, all of them are tabulated. At that point, it's official. So now we come back to this. Both parties, they can pick whoever they want as electors. The final thing here is, Ricky, you're an elector, you've been selected, let's say in Alabama, let's say in Wyoming, let's say in Utah, it doesn't make any difference. Let's say in Maine. You can't, Ricky, say, I don't like Donald Trump. Now remember, the Republicans picked you as their elector. You cannot decide on you could say, I can't stand Trump. I'm not going to vote for him as an elector. Well, the Supreme Court knocked that out. No, you're duty bound. You have to go along with the party's choice and whoever won the most electoral votes in that state. You cannot break ranks. They call them dissident electors. There have been a few times in history when you've had electors that have gone against what the established rules are. They've been slapped down every time. Can't do that. There are two states, Nebraska and Maine. They have a split electoral system. You can actually divvy up the electors. But those are the only two states. What's the population of Nebraska? What's the population of Maine? How many electoral votes are we talking about there? So, no, the Electoral College is firm. Let's do a recap. 1, it takes 270 electoral votes to win. Number 2, there are 538 electoral votes. Number 3, the parties in each state, they choose their electors. Number 4, the second Wednesday in the second week after the election is certified with the number of electoral votes. There cannot be any dissident electors. No, that can't happen. Why the Electoral College? The Founding Fathers feared Leroy Jackson and Oliver, the mob, the tyranny, dominating everything, and they didn't have the population in those states. And the other thing, the big northern states, they had the population. One other little item, many of them were slaveholders, as you know, the Founding Fathers, Washington, Jefferson, they were slaveholders. So what they did was a little thing called, how can we count Leroy? I mean, not Leroy. Well, maybe Leroy too. How can we count Vino? How can we count Oliver? I.e., remember, you're not a human being. You're a slave. Okay, 3/5 of a person. That was a concession to the southern states to bump up their numbers, to give them more numbers. So that was a compromise measure. The 3/5 back then, 3/5 of a man. Now, of course, 3/5 of a person. Okay. God, the fact is they were very generous, even giving you 3/5. I mean, I'm surprised at that. Only for proportional reasons. That's all. Not because they thought you were 3/5 of a human being, only because they needed to bump the numbers up. Okay, argument 4. Argument 4 having the Electoral College. First argument, it's a fair system because in only a few cases in presidential history, and this is where it gets interesting, almost all cases, with maybe 4 or 5 exceptions, the Electoral College vote tabulates very closely with the popular vote. Very closely. It's only been 4 or 5 times. And by the way, the last one was 2016, Trump, where the Electoral College did not tabulate Oliver with the popular vote. Hillary Clinton beat Trump in the popular vote by 3 to 5 million votes. 2000, remember, Al Gore won the popular vote. But the Electoral College, 2000, went to George Bush Jr. We know in 2016 it went to Leroy's guy, Donald Trump. All right, so but those are rare instances. It usually tabulates. So the argument for keeping the Electoral College, 1, is fair. 2, it's very close to the popular vote. And 3, if you didn't have the Electoral College, Ricky, think about this. Why, if I'm a candidate, would I ever go to Maine? I would never go there. Where would I hang out, Oliver? I would hang out in what state? I would hang out in California. I would hang out in New York. Why would I go to Nebraska? Why would I go to Wisconsin? So in other words, it's fair because now it forces presidential candidates to do what? Go to Nebraska, go to Wisconsin, go to Michigan, states that would be neglected before if it was just a popular vote. Okay. And there are many other arguments too. There's even a thing called, why don't we have a proportional system? That's been advanced, too. And there's a big move now among many states, primarily Democrat, to do this, to align the popular vote directly with the electoral vote. Not get rid of the Electoral College, but if, let's say, Oliver gets 100 votes in Maine, Leroy gets 99, doesn't make any difference what the Electoral College says. You get the vote of the state, including the electoral votes. You got about 23 states that have signed on to that so far. I'm a little skeptical of that going anywhere because why? The red states don't want that. Because remember, they're smaller states, and they have a vested interest in protecting the Electoral College. The arguments, there are many arguments against that. We've already talked one. Let's have a popular vote, period. Whoever gets the most votes, simple as that, decides it. The second thing is, one of the other arguments against that, there would be too much fraud there. That then you could be manipulating the popular vote and blah, blah, blah. We get that too. So it's a mix. There are many arguments against. There are many arguments why we should get rid of the Electoral College. Many arguments why we should keep the Electoral College. So it really comes down to this when you're talking about the Electoral College. I gave you a little recap about the numbers that we need, how it's used, how electors are decided, the inordinate influence of the parties in selecting the electors. And there are a number of other things, too, about that vote. Now, it's inelastic in this sense. There's going to be an increase with population over time in the number of electors. So we have 538 electors now. Based on the next census, that will probably bump up close to 600 electors. Now, do we see, looking into the future, is there any possibility of getting rid of the Electoral College? First of all, remember, the Electoral College is the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. Keep that in mind. The Electoral College is the 12th Amendment. What does that mean? You've got to have what? To get rid of, to change an amendment. You've got to, first of all, Congress has to pass it. It has to go to the states, and it has to have 2/3 of the states that have to ratify it. Can you imagine Alabama? Can you imagine Nebraska? Can you imagine Wyoming? Can you imagine Maine? The legislators there voting as part of a move to scrap the 12th Amendment? I don't see that. Yeah. Not in the foreseeable future, and even in the intermediate future. I think we're stuck with the Electoral College. I think at this point in time, the presidency will be decided, obviously this year, by the Electoral College. The presidency will be decided probably in 2024 and 2028, unless something dramatic happens. But that's a tough one to get around. Getting around, changing, scrapping an amendment. So the Electoral College, for better or for worse, better and worse, is here to stay.
The Hutchinson Report.
There will be major battles within the Senate, the House, Congress, and the White House, whoever the president is.
Your host, Earl Afari Hutchinson.
We got to cut this. We got to cut that. We got to raise taxes. Why? Because you've got to raise that money somewhere, and we know 1% corporate cronies, they're not going to pay their share.
Tune into the Hutchinson Report, Saturdays at 9 a.m.
Once again, it falls back on the shoulder of guess who? Joe and Jane, blue collar and poor person. There is no free lunch.
Right here on KPFK.